Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I promise to try not to bore you too much, but if I do, tough. As the title suggests, I'm here to talk about the reality of kind of how cybersecurity has changed in the last couple of years, and really what that means for us as both kind of individuals that protect organizations, but also individuals that test organizations at scale. Magic. So just to very briefly introduce who we are, my name is Benjamin Harris. I'm the CEO, founder, head janitor, whatever you want to call me for watchTowr. We build attack surface management and continuous automated red teaming technology. So with our years of experience breaking into banks, insurers, governments, we've basically built technology that's automated what we've done in ICAST, CBEST, ASC exercises. Ultimately, our aim is to help organizations understand if you are targeted today, as you likely are, by a capable adversary, how would they gain access, what would they see? We're the team that you hear about in the news, so we're not just technology builders, but we are the troublemakers that keep breaking enterprise technology. Most recently, we kind of picked on SSL VPN devices, so think Fortinet 0 days, Juniper 0 days. Ultimately, though, our point is to help organizations understand that these external DMZ devices are highly critical to an organization's posture, but when they say secure on them, it's usually a lie. So I think, as we all know, ransomware is not new. It's exploded in the last couple of years. I'm sure the window that you see on the screen right now is familiar, if not traumatic, for some of you at this point. I think it's an image that we've all become very familiar with, and the problem itself has become something that we are innately familiar with as an industry. I think what we've seen, even though there was a slight slowdown last year, is that ransomware attacks continue to grow, both in terms of velocity, in terms of audaciousness, in terms of what they really want to achieve from that attack, right? And I think we can kind of see from the damage costs exponentially rising, the fact that we're seeing attacks incrementally increase, combined with the fact that we are now seeing significantly more vulnerabilities in the real world. But what's really changed in the last couple of years is that ransomware has gone from being, some kids in their bedroom with a copy of an encryptor that they gain access to systems to an industry. It's become a particular part of an industry that now monetizes, professionalizes the ability to gain access to organizations, ransomware them at scale, and ultimately extort them. We now see ransomware gangs building out front companies, hiring people, building out interview processes to find the right people to help them in their aim for mass destruction, whatever you want to call it. But I particularly enjoyed that article that kind of talked about performance reviews that happened at PwC for a while, Employee of the Month. I daren't imagine what might get you that title, but I'm sure we can all figure it out. But what's even more jarring, for lack of a better phrase, is that they actually now have organizational structure. So I think if you look back historically, structure in cybersecurity attack teams is actually not new. We've seen this for many years, but typically at the nation-state level, where you would have military teams that were designed and built to give multiple capabilities to operations to ensure the efficiency, the efficacy of a cyber attack against a perhaps nation-state linked objective. That same exponential motivation has now been driven over to the ransomware gang world because they are just driven by financial profit. There's a very, very simple mechanism for them to make money from these attacks. And so taking that kind of capability and professionalizing it has become very, very real. What this means, though, is that we deal with a new breed of attacker. The characteristics that we used to describe nation-state APT groups with, persistent, aggressive, well-resourced, well-funded, now apply very frankly, to Eastern European, Russian ransomware gangs that are looking to target organizations that we all work with. And so it's come to a point where we can no longer say that the attacker's pyramid in terms of capability is any more relevant than it was before. In fact, it's become less relevant. We've seen all of these capabilities, all of these characteristics truly trickle down to the point where they now are on the capability level that we would expect our organizations to be targeted with. That means our threat model has completely changed. Where historically a lot of organizations could sit there and go, yes, there's a new 0 day, there are new tactics, techniques being used, but I'm not targeted by nation state 1, 2, 3, therefore I may not need to move so quickly. That has now completely changed. Ransomware gangs with their well-resourced, well-funded, structured teams are now incredibly motivated to be constantly looking for ways into organizations. If I kind of converse that to how we typically have historically approached cybersecurity testing in organizations with an annual pen test, a quarterly VA, it no longer holds muster. It no longer makes sense in terms of how we test defenses, how we look at how we're going to get targeted, or how quickly we even look to remediate weaknesses. If that ransomware gang knows that there's a $6 million payout from taking that new 0-day that dropped this morning and using it against your organization at 1 p.m., trust me, they will. And so waiting until that quarterly VA to start, even if it was next week, it's too late. This thing hates me. So why are these attacks seemingly so successful? I mean, we hear about them in the news all the time. I don't think we've not heard about ransomware for at least 10 minutes at this point. So why are they seemingly so successful? Actually, we pull it back to fundamental core capabilities that most organizations have still struggled with for the last 10 years. Understanding what you're actually protecting is still very difficult for a lot of organizations. Now, there are lots of reasons for this, right? Organic merger and acquisition, usage of SaaS platforms, the explosion of cloud environments, or just your marketing team not telling you about what they're doing. The reality is, though, that for most cybersecurity teams inside organizations, saying we know exactly what we have exposed to the internet has become really, really difficult. I like to visualize it like this, and it's slightly violent, but bear with me. Historically, most organizations have tracked their external perimeter in a spreadsheet. Got our list of IP ranges we own, list of domains, list of subdomains, and it hasn't changed for 10 years. The reality, though, is when an attacker looks at an organization, they see something completely different. We've seen time and time again that attackers or the attacker approach to building visibility of an organization is highly effective. Because they know that they don't really care about ownership, they don't really care about your network architecture, all they care about is exposed information. If someone's exposing credentials in a personal GitHub repository, if they've got a random router plugged into your factory in country B, that's what they care about because it could be the open door. And so for cybersecurity teams to understand what do we have exposed to the internet, we have to pull it away from logical ownership structures and back to what do attackers see. It really hates me. As an industry, we know this is fairly kind of logical, right? You can't protect what you don't know about. And to our advantage, the analysts finally agree. When Gartner agrees, good things generally happen. What I would say, though, is that it's not enough. Knowing what you have exposed to the internet isn't going to solve all your problems, because we then see the next challenge. Vulnerability disclosures, discovery has exploded. Now, there are tons of reasons for this, right? Increased interest in cybersecurity, more attention to different pieces of software. It's not that things became vulnerable suddenly, it's that we started looking. But what this actually means is that we now see a massive increase in the number of vulnerabilities discovered every year. I mean, I'm sure everyone in this room can think back to the last 2 weeks where we saw 2 CVSS 10 Confluent 0 days. We've seen SonicWall 0 days, Fortinet the last 14 days alone. But what's equally scary is that there's now data around how quickly this gets weaponized. It's not a case of, oh, there's new vulnerability, maybe in 2 months' time we'll see exploitation. It's now 6 hours in some cases. And so when you're dealing with that aggression, that persistence from a ransomware gang, it's no longer an option as to whether we patch, we understand if we're vulnerable or not. It's actually a necessity at this point. It really hates me. Even some cases, we're seeing it yet even more aggressive. With ransomware gangs like Clop now investing in their own 0 days, it's now become incredibly important that organizations actually know what they have exposed to the internet. What are you protecting? Does it have to be exposed? And that is the question that I find myself asking a lot of organizations quite a lot. Does that system really need to be exposed to the internet? Is the risk worth it today? So we see 3 primary challenges from the watchTower side. Number 1, the visibility piece. Absolutely, we can't do anything about systems we don't know about. But at the same time, the speed in which we see new tactics, techniques explode into the public space has really changed. Combine that with the speed at which exploitation now occurs, you're basically in a constant race. Unfortunately, time zones don't care about us. It's a case of if something drops at a particular time, how quickly can we work out if we're exposed? How quickly can we work out if we're vulnerable? I can see some people looking stressed. I'm sorry. It's just reality. So how do we combat this and this clicker that seemingly doesn't like me very much? Well, we have to actually begin to behave like attackers. I know we've said this a lot, the attacker mindset, how do we envision, how do we embody how attackers work? And we've seen that leak into the red teaming space, right? That attacker mindset used to breach organizations. But now we need to add the persistence, the aggression that we see ransomware gangs using against organizations. We need to have real-time attack surface visibility. From our perspective, and I'm sure as I kind of have made the point a little bit so far, this isn't a static thing. I pick on them a lot, but marketing teams are the cause of 80% of all these issues. If we could remove marketing teams from most organizations, they'd probably become materially more secure. But tongue-in-cheek, what I basically mean is that because there's so much shadow IT, so many different departments, different teams in different countries exposing systems to the internet, ultimately it actually becomes very difficult. And so we have to take that attacker's approach. What is actually exposed right now? We have to be continuously testing. This, to me, is really important. We can't trust that the pen test we did last year in November still reflects the organization's security posture. Very frankly, we can't trust the pen test we did yesterday still reflects the organization's security posture. Not because pen testing isn't relevant, but because the industry moves so quickly. When attackers are being incredibly opportunistic, spraying their latest zero-day across the internet, you have to understand what has changed today. How is that going to affect me? When I talk to organizations about this, they typically tell me they're scared of being overwhelmed by vulnerabilities. And this is where the red teaming ethos, the attacker mindset, really comes to play in terms of how we continuously test. Your weak TLS ciphers on your primary corporate domain, I promise you, you're not going to get breached because of that. It's never been part of any APT group kill chain. But the rote code execution on the random server in the corner, in one of 50,000 of your assets, will be the thing that leads to your downfall. And so it's about understanding what's actually exploitable, how do we prioritize, how do we validate the impact of these vulnerabilities before we panic and actually go into kind of combat mode. This then ultimately underpins an ability to rapidly react to emerging threats. And this is what I feel is truly important that feeds into both those capabilities. If we have an understanding as to what the organization looks like, what technology is exposed, we have the apparatus, the capability to continuously test, very quickly we can build detection mechanisms, we can build demonstrable exploitation validation as to whether a system is or isn't vulnerable. In literally an hour and a half. That's what becomes really, really important. So when does this help? Now, excuse me, it's going to sound a little bit watchTowr biased, but I am who I am. We see this in numerous cases. I think MOVEit is a fantastic example. As we all know, MOVEit was an extremely painful ordeal, traumatic again, possibly for some in here. What we saw with MOVEit was actually these problems combined in one go, right? So number one was visibility. Do we even have MOVEit? We worked with organizations that thought they had 3 instances. They had 7. So it became quite painful quite quickly. The second part that became very difficult in MOVEit was then the entire security industry jumped on MOVEit as an easy punching bag. And so we saw weeks of zero-day disclosures afterwards, some of which then got picked up again by ransomware gangs to use. So MOVEit is a great example of where knowing where you're actually exposed, being able to continuously test, identify if these systems are exploitable, actually helps prevent breaches. That's ultimately what this comes down to. This is a very good example of what we do at watchTowr. So, given our red teaming background, our focus is on understanding what vulnerabilities are going to be painful, how they're going to hurt organizations, and how quickly we can translate that sense of pain incoming to actual tangible results to clients. As I'm sure everyone has seen, over the last few months, we've seen Fortinet devices just basically implode due to numerous reasons. In this example, this is how, using kind of an attack surface management-led approach with proper scale, you can actually help organizations get ahead of this type of vulnerability. On a Saturday, we heard a rumor of an incoming remote code execution in Fortinet devices. I don't know if you know much about Fortinet, but they embargo every single vulnerability until the day of they choose. They release the patches 2 weeks before, but they embargo all the information. And so it's a guessing game, regardless. With our internal research capability, we can basically patch diff against binary updates, understand what they've actually rectified, begin to build detection mechanisms, and push those out to clients proactively. So that 2 days later, when Fortinet finally admit there is a vulnerability, and then APT exploitation begins the same day, watchTowr clients already know if they were affected, can already take systems offline, can already patch. I know I sound like a broken record, but to me, this genuinely prevents breaches. It genuinely stops bad things from happening. And ultimately, we cannot rely on security vendors like Fortinet anymore to actually do their jobs. I know it's a bit blunt, but it is what it is. The other example is then really beginning to simulate how adversaries actually breach organizations. I think we come from a world with annual pen testing where technical validation of control is very important. Is my web app secure? Is my server secure? Does it look like it's being breached? Et cetera, et cetera. But we're seeing attackers take the easy route now. If they can buy credentials from a password stealer log somewhere, they can then use those to log into a legitimate VPN. No skills required, just a keyboard. But ultimately, that's what we have to incorporate into continuous testing as well. If they can buy those credentials, we can acquire them as well. And by using automation, instead of just saying there are 1,000 leaked credentials on the internet for your organization, please reset, we can say of the 1,000 that are leaked, 3 work, 2 are single factor authentication, and 1 of them had access to your Swift environment. That becomes really powerful in actually prioritizing, rapidly reacting to how an attacker is actually going to breach your organization. Anyway, I am going to stop rambling. Hopefully that was relatively interesting. Maybe not. Regardless, you're at the end now. So, but thank you very much for listening so politely. Nobody booed, so that's generally good. Happy to talk about what we do at watchTowr if it's of interest. Otherwise, have a great rest of the day, and thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.